Don't do this." But the rancher did it anyway, and the whole town was outraged. Henry Caldwell had always been known in the small town of Willow Creek as a man who did things his own way. He was a rancher by profession, a man whose life revolved around the land, his cattle, and the routines that defined the rhythm of the rural life he had grown up with. People admired him for his hard work and dedication. He had inherited the ranch from his father, who had worked tirelessly to build it from the ground up, and Henry had taken that legacy and expanded it, making it one of the largest and most productive ranches in the area. Despite his strong reputation, Henry had a stubborn streak that sometimes made him difficult to deal with. He believed in taking bold steps and making tough decisions without always asking for approval. That particular summer, the weather had been unusually dry, and the ranch required more space for the growing herd of cattle. The solution Henry decided on, however, would soon ignite a firestorm across the entire town. Near the center of the town's open meadow stood a group of old oak trees. They were not ordinary trees. They were majestic, with thick trunks and wide canopies that had stood there for decades, perhaps even a century. The townspeople loved those trees. They were a place where children played, families held picnics, and elderly residents came to sit in the shade and watch the seasons change. Over the years, the trees had become part of the town's identity, and everyone felt a sense of pride in their presence. One afternoon, as Henry walked around the property surveying his land, he made a decision. The oak trees were in the way of his planned expansion for the cattle pens. To him, they were simply obstacles that needed to be removed. He envisioned a larger area for the cattle to graze freely and believed this would improve the productivity of the ranch. In his mind, the solution was clear, and he began making plans to cut down the trees. Word of Henry's plan spread quickly, and soon, a few of the town's residents approached him. Among them was Martha Jenkins, a longtime resident whose family had lived in Willow Creek for generations. She loved the meadow and the trees as much as anyone, and she felt a deep responsibility to protect them. She, along with a few others, tried to reason with Henry. Don't do this," she said, her voice full of concern and worry. "These trees are part of our town's history. They've been here longer than any of us have. You can't just take them down for your cattle. I have to think about the future and the livelihood of my family. The cattle need more space, and this is the best solution." They told stories of childhood memories, of weddings held under the branches, of quiet afternoons spent reading in the shade. But Henry's mind was already made up. To him, progress sometimes required difficult decisions, and he believed that his responsibility to the ranch came first. The night before Henry planned to begin the tree removal, the town was restless. People gathered at the local cafe, at the post office, and at the general store, discussing what Henry was about to do. Some were angry, some were sad, and some were simply anxious about how this would affect the community. They remembered all the small things that had happened around those trees, the laughter of children, the quiet moments of reflection, the community events that had taken place in their shade. The thought that all of this could disappear overnight filled them with a sense of dread. Meanwhile, Henry stayed awake, going over his plans. He checked his equipment, mapped out how he would remove the trees, and considered the logistics of transporting the lumber. In his mind, it was just another day of work, another problem to solve. Yet deep down, he felt a flicker of unease. He knew the town would be upset, and he wondered how people would react. He tried to push the thought aside. He had made decisions like this before and had faced criticism. This was just another challenge, and he was determined to see it through. As dawn broke the next day, Henry arrived at the meadow with his tools and machinery. The sun cast a golden light over the fields, and the trees stood tall, as if they were silently watching him. Townspeople began to gather, some walking quietly toward the meadow, others arriving in small groups. There was a tension in the air that could almost be felt, a mix of anger, disbelief, and sadness. Martha Jenkins was among the first to arrive. She stood at the edge of the meadow, her eyes fixed on Henry. "Please, Henry, think about what you're doing," she said softly, yet firmly. "This isn't just about land. This is about our history, our memories, and our town. Once these trees are gone, they're gone forever." He marked the trees, checking which ones would come down first, and started the machines that would do the work. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the town waking up and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. People whispered to each other, trying to find ways to stop him, but nothing seemed to work. That day, the town experienced a mixture of emotions that no one could forget. There was frustration, as people realized that legal rights often outweighed community sentiment. There was sadness, as they imagined the loss of a place that had been part of their lives for so long. And there was a sense of helplessness, as they realized that sometimes people make decisions that cannot be reversed. Henry continued his work throughout the morning. He moved carefully, knowing the size and age of the trees made the task dangerous. The townspeople watched from a distance, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others silent in sorrow. Even those who had not been present at the cafe or the post office the night before began arriving, drawn by curiosity and concern. The news had spread quickly, and soon the entire town was gathered around the meadow, witnessing an event that would become the center of conversation for months to come. By the time the sun reached its peak, Henry had completed the preparation. He paused for a moment and looked around. The trees still stood, strong and proud, but soon that would change. He knew that once he started, there would be no turning back. In that moment, a quiet reflection crossed his mind. He had always believed in doing what was necessary, but for the first time, he wondered if he had considered everything. The townspeople's voices grew louder, a chorus of warnings, pleas, and objections, yet Henry remained determined. This was his land, his responsibility, and his decision. He understood the consequences, but he believed that the future of his ranch depended on taking this step. And so, the stage was set. The next few hours would determine not just the fate of the ancient oak trees, but also the relationship between Henry and the town he had been a part of all his life. The tension in the air was palpable, and everyone knew that history was being made, whether they wanted it to or not. Henry took a deep breath and prepared himself. He was ready to carry out what he had decided, fully aware that his choice would bring both criticism and lasting memories of a conflict that would be remembered in Willow Creek for generations. The story of the stubborn rancher and the ancient trees had only just begun, and no one in the town would ever forget that day when a man chose to follow his own path, despite the heartfelt warnings of everyone around him. The next morning, the town of Willow Creek woke with a sense of tension that had never been felt before. News of Henry Caldwell's plan to remove the ancient oak trees had spread like wildfire. By the time the sun peeked over the hills, a crowd had already gathered at the edge of the meadow, their faces filled with worry, anger, and disbelief. Parents held the hands of their children, older residents leaned on their walking sticks, and younger townsfolk whispered urgently to one another, all united by a shared concern for the trees that had been a part of their lives for so long. Henry arrived at the meadow early, before most people had assembled, bringing with him the equipment needed to carry out the work. The large chainsaws, axes, and machinery gleamed in the morning sunlight. He had worked carefully to plan the removal, knowing the size and age of the trees made it a difficult and dangerous task. Yet, as he stepped out of his truck and looked at the massive oaks, he felt a momentary pause in his determination. The trees stood tall and proud, their branches stretching toward the sky as if silently challenging him. Martha Jenkins, who had spent the previous night worrying and discussing the situation with neighbors, was among the first to arrive. She called out to Henry, her voice trembling slightly. "Please, Henry, think about what you're doing. These trees have been part of our town for decades. Once they're gone, we can never get them back." Her eyes were wet with tears, reflecting the deep emotional connection she and the town had with the meadow. Henry took a deep breath and met her gaze. "I hear you, Martha," he said calmly, "but I have to do what I think is right for the ranch. I hope someday you'll understand." Despite the softness in his voice, there was an unwavering firmness in his stance. To him, the survival and growth of the ranch were essential, and he felt that this step was necessary for the future. The townspeople began to gather in larger numbers. By mid-morning, almost the entire town was present, forming a semicircle around the meadow. Some held handmade signs, others simply stood silently, unable to believe what was happening. There were whispers of disbelief, conversations filled with worry, and quiet moments of reflection on the memories tied to the ancient trees. The town had become a living, breathing witness to a moment that would soon be remembered for generations. Henry began his work cautiously, marking which trees would be removed first. As the machines roared to life, the sound echoed across the valley, startling birds from the branches and causing small animals to scurry into the underbrush. The crowd reacted immediately. Some shouted in protest, others tried to physically block the machinery, but Henry remained focused. He knew that once the first cut was made, the process could not be stopped. The first oak tree fell with a heavy crash that resonated through the meadow. Gasps and cries filled the air. People covered their mouths in disbelief, some even stepping back in shock. The sight of the massive tree crashing to the ground left an impression that would be forever etched in the minds of those watching. Henry paused for a brief moment, looking at the fallen giant. He felt a pang of guilt but quickly reminded himself of his purpose. The ranch needed this space, and he had to continue. As the day went on, more trees were brought down, one by one. The crowd's emotions fluctuated between sadness, anger, and helplessness. Conversations erupted among them. Some argued about whether Henry had the right to do this, while others discussed what could be done to protect the remaining trees. There was a growing sense of urgency, a hope that somehow the destruction could be stopped before it was too late. Even as tensions grew, there were moments of quiet reflection. Elderly residents shared stories with children about how their grandparents had enjoyed the meadow, how picnics under the oak trees had created lifelong memories, and how the branches had been a sanctuary during difficult times. These stories reminded the younger generation why the trees meant so much to the town, creating a deeper emotional connection to the event unfolding before them. By mid-afternoon, the reality of the situation became clear. Several of the oldest and largest trees had already been removed. The once shaded meadow now appeared bare and exposed, with large gaps where mighty oaks had once stood. The townspeople's grief was visible. Children clung to their parents, elders shook their heads in disbelief, and Martha Jenkins' voice trembled as she called out to Henry once more. "Please stop. Enough is enough." For the first time, he began to realize the full weight of his actions. Yes, the ranch would benefit from the expanded space, but the cost was far greater than he had anticipated. It was not just trees that were being removed. It was a part of the town's heart, its shared history, and the memories of generations. The town's response began to escalate. Local news reporters arrived to cover the story, bringing cameras and microphones. Soon, the event was no longer just a local concern. It became a story that reached neighboring towns and online communities. Social media lit up with posts, photos, and videos, showing the dramatic removal of the trees and the outrage of the townspeople. Opinions were divided. Some people praised Henry for his determination and his right to manage his property, while others criticized him for his lack of consideration for the community and its heritage. As the day drew to a close, Henry had completed the removal of the trees he had planned to cut down. The once lush and shaded meadow now looked stark and empty, with only the smaller, younger trees left standing. Henry felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, he had accomplished his goal and prepared the land for the ranch's expansion. On the other hand, he could not ignore the sadness in the faces of the townspeople and the tension that had now grown between him and his neighbors. The evening brought a temporary calm to the town. People left the meadow, but conversations continued throughout Willow Creek. In homes, cafes, and the general store, discussions about the event filled the air. The town was divided. Some people believed Henry had done what was necessary and respected his legal rights, while others felt betrayed, hurt, and angry. The ancient oak trees were gone, but their absence had left a lasting impression on the town's collective memory. Henry returned to his ranch, exhausted and reflective. He thought about the morning, the crowd, and the faces of people who had trusted him and shared the land with him for so long. He realized that being right legally did not always mean being right morally or socially. The actions he had taken had consequences beyond the boundaries of his property, affecting relationships, trust, and the sense of community. In the days that followed, the town began to take action. Some residents organized a campaign to plant new trees, hoping to restore a sense of greenery to the meadow, even if it could never replace the old oaks. Others started to discuss ways to preserve historical parts of the town to prevent similar events from happening in the future. Though the controversy was painful, it also sparked a renewed sense of involvement and care among the townspeople. Henry, meanwhile, reflected deeply on his choices. He had always believed in making decisions for the long-term benefit of his ranch, but he now understood that progress should consider the emotional and social impact on the community. He knew that rebuilding trust would take time and effort. The relationships he had taken for granted were now fragile, and he needed to find a way to mend them if he wanted to remain part of the town's life. In the end, the story of Henry Caldwell and the ancient oak trees became more than just a tale of land and livestock. It became a lesson for the entire town and beyond, a reminder that actions, even when legal or practical, carry consequences that affect more than just the immediate situation. Decisions made without consideration for the shared history, emotions, and values of a community can leave scars that last much longer than the original problem. The empty meadow, once a place of joy and relaxation, stood as a silent witness to the events that had unfolded. And though new trees would be planted and the town would eventually heal, the memory of that day, the day when a stubborn rancher chose to follow his own path despite heartfelt warnings, would remain in the hearts and minds of Willow Creek forever.